Chapter 16 looks at death and the way that we grieve the death of others. So, let's see. The top cause of deaths among the elderly today are heart disease, cancer, and stroke. Those are the primary causes of death for those that in late adulthood. Care of the dying. So two different terms that you should know is hospice care, which you can off of here write the H usually refers to the care being provided in the home. H, hospice, home. Okay, so it's warm, personal, patient, and family-centered care for a person with a terminal illness. So hospice care is usually in the home. And then palliative care refers to more of comfort care. It's a relief of pain and suffering that allows the patient to die with peace and dignity. Palliative care is, you have the P here, it focuses on pain, pain removal or pain relief. P, pain relief. H, hospice. Palliative care can happen alongside, hospice care, taking care of the pain, but just so that you know the difference. And watch the video that'll explain palliative and hospice care a little bit more. All right, so facing death and loss. So people often undergo a cognitive and functional decline shortly before death. This is called the terminal drop or terminal decline. And this can happen anywhere, 15 years before death, or as little as a couple of weeks before death. So it's called the terminal decline or the terminal drop. Look at this research article that provides some support for this cognitive decline or this terminal drop. All right, so confronting one death. Kubler-Ross proposed 5 stages that we go through or could go through when we're coming to terms with dying. So there's denial, this can't be happening to me. Anger, why me? Bargaining, if only I can have 2 more months, I won't ask for anything else, something to that extent. And then you have depression and acceptance. The way that I remember it is DABDA. So denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Or a student had the sentence written down that death always brings deep acceptance. That's the way that they remembered it, and that helped them. So you can write that sentence in over to the side if you feel that that's helpful. Death always brings deep acceptance. All right, so these stages do not necessarily happen in the denial and then anger and then bargaining, and everybody does not necessarily go through every single one of them, but it offers us a framework for understanding how people come to terms with death. All right, so patterns of grieving. So the term bereavement refers to a sense of loss due to death of somebody to whom one feels close, and it's the process of adjusting to this loss. So the most widely studied pattern of grief work moves from shock, I'm in disbelief, I can't believe that this happened, to preoccupation, just constantly thinking about the person, everything that you do, everything that you see reminds you of the person that passed away. And then finally, there's resolution. And I definitely saw this with my mom when her mother died. When I first went over to see my mom, she was just in this state of shock. She pretty much just slept for the first few days. It was too much for her to take in at the time. And then over the next, say, 2 years, pretty much everything that we talked about, everything that we saw, everything that we did, she would bring up the memory of my grandma. And that's normal, this preoccupation. And then usually you'll see a resolution, coming to terms with the loss of the person. All right, so people often find that when a death is ambiguous, when the death is unclear, when there's some uncertainty around a person's death, that it is going to be the most difficult to come to terms with. So it refers to a death that is unclear, ambiguous, unclear, such as when a person is reported missing in action or presumed dead. So there isn't a body there to be able to bury, to be able to grieve, to be able to come to terms with, to be able to have closure. So ambiguous deaths tend to be the most difficult to be able to resolve, to be able to come to terms with. With this ambiguous death, after 9/11, there was a lot of this. A lot of people had a difficult time being able to grieve, to be able to come to terms with what had happened from the terrorist attacks, because not all the bodies, very few of the bodies actually, were found, were able to be buried, were able to have, the family be able to look and say, okay, here's the person that I loved, let's have this funeral, let's have a wake. Very few people were able to do that, making the bereavement process very difficult. Let's look at attitudes about death and dying across the lifespan. So how we deal with death, how we process it, is different from childhood until late adulthood. So really, we don't understand death. We don't understand that death is irreversible, that somebody cannot come back to life, that it is universal, that everybody dies, and it is inevitable, that that it is going to happen. You can't avoid it. And they don't understand non-functionality, that all life functions end at death. This doesn't really occur until age 5 to 7, somewhere in and around there. Do children start to understand these to be able to understand death fully? So something that a child, maybe before 5 might say is that after maybe their grandma has passed away and been buried, they're going to say, I wonder if grandma's hungry. Maybe we should bring her a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Okay, they don't understand that all functions end at death. All right, they might say something like, well, how is grandma going to be able to breathe in the casket? They don't understand that grandma's no longer breathing. They might still ask, is grandma going to be there for Christmas? Now understanding that is irreversible. All right, so 5 to 7 is the key here to being able to understand, and this has to do with the cognitive development, just not able to understand these abstract concepts or even be able to begin to grasp them. All right, so children tend to find a loss, the death of somebody, more difficult when it was a troubled relationship. If they fought with the person, if there was some unresolved business with the person, if the death was unexpected, if the child had emotional and behavioral problems before death, it's very likely that you're going to see more of those problems afterwards, as well as it is most difficult when there is when social support is lacking. This is when children find the loss more difficult. Now, adolescents tend to be very egocentric, so that is how they also deal with death during that time. So they're not really thinking about death and how it can happen to them. They're more concerned about how to live rather than how long they will live. Remember, we talked about that personal fable that adolescents have, that egocentrism, personal fable, that they have this own story that they tell themselves, that they're invincible, that death will not happen to them, that bad things will not happen to them. So that's you see those characteristics with adolescents and how they deal with death, how they think about death. Now, as you move into young adulthood, when you experience maybe somebody that you know that is your same age that dies when they're, say, in their 20s, early 30s, something like that, it can lead to a lot of frustration and rage. There's this feeling of they just started their life. They're just getting to the part where, they're seeing all this work that they did in college, and now they just maybe had their children. So they're just starting to live their life that they have been planning for. So there tends to be a lot of frustration and rage when you're dealing with the death of somebody who was in their 20s, 30s. All right. Now, middle age, there's more acceptance of mortality. Why is that? Because there's the physical, like bodies are starting to send signals that they are not as young. So they're starting to realize that that they're not what's the word? Invincible? Yeah. Or that death is, it's not inevitable. It's going to happen, and you start feeling it in your body, in that some of your senses start declining. So bodies start sending signals that you're not as young, so you're coming to terms with this. Now, older adults have mixed feelings. There can be fear, denial, acceptance. Those who have resolved Erickson's ego, integrity versus despair stage tend to be more accepting of death. So if they have the sense of integrity, that they lived a good life, then there's going to be less despair. So surviving a spouse, for some, widowhood can ultimately become a positive developmental experience, especially for women. Maybe it can become a catalyst for introspection and growth. Maybe if they have been very much playing the role of caretaker for their husband and children, perhaps they see, at first it's going to be very, very difficult with the grieving, but perhaps after a time of grieving, that they may start looking towards their own personal growth and maybe start going and traveling and doing things for themselves a little bit more. Losing a child can be very difficult. Generally feels that that they've failed the child in some sort of way. Make sure that you read all these different parts so that you get all that information. Suicide. Suicide rates are higher among men, whites, and Native Americans. So men tend to be more successful in their suicide attempts. Women tend to make more suicide attempts, but men tend to use more fatal means of their suicide attempts. All right, some different terms that you need to know is you have passive euthanasia and active euthanasia. Passive euthanasia is withholding or discontinuing treatment that might extend life, like medication, life support, feeding tubes, things of that sort. Make sure that you watch this video because it'll break it all down. You have active euthanasia, which is more of a mercy killing, when you're actively taking action to shorten a person's life. When somebody is suffering, you're like, oh, I don't want to see them suffering anymore. So passive euthanasia, it's legal. Active euthanasia, on the other hand, is not. This assisted suicide means it's a form of active euthanasia. It's assisting a person in actively ending their life. So there are some states that allow this assisted suicide. Not very many of them in the U.S., but there are some. All right, some other terms to know is advance directive or a living will. It's this document that specifies the type of care that a patient wants in the event of a terminal illness. So you do up a living will while before things get so bad that you aren't able to voice your desires, So you do up a living will so that in the event that you can't speak for yourself, that you have it written down what you would like done. So durable power of attorney is this legal instrument that appoints an individual to make decisions in the event that the other person is no longer able to. So a durable power of attorney. When my grandmother when her health was failing, she made up a durable power of attorney for my aunt to be able to make the legal decisions, to be able to act in her name, legally speaking. Okay? So watch the video and read through each of these. I only hit on some of the main point, but there's a lot in here, so make sure you read through it very carefully, and I will see you in class.